Sometimes life breaks you so completely that you stop believing in second chances. Calder knew that feeling all too well when he bought a burned cabin in the Montana woods with the last of his savings. He'd lost his marriage, his home, and nearly his will to keep going. The charred walls felt right somehow. They matched what he felt inside. With only his dog Sawyer beside him, he began rebuilding in silence. Then one morning, Sawyer started digging beneath the cabin and wouldn't stop. What Calder found changed everything. A hidden trapdoor, and a journal from a man who had lived there before. A man who had suffered just like him. What secret was buried beneath those ashes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Calder had stood in this same spot, staring at what remained of his investment. The cabin looked like something from a nightmare. Blackened timber reaching toward the sky like charred fingers, a section of roof collapsed inward, windows blown out and jagged. The smell of old smoke still clung to everything, acrid and bitter, mixing with the sweet scent of pine from the surrounding forest. He'd driven 12 hours from Denver with everything he owned packed into the back of his truck. Sawyer had ridden beside him the whole way, that tan and gray mutt with the perpetually worried eyes, as if the dog knew they were running towards something uncertain, or maybe running away from something certain. The distinction didn't matter much anymore. The real estate listing had been brutally honest. Fire-damaged cabin on 5 acres. Sold as is. Cash only. The price reflected the damage, barely more than land value, and even that was cheap this far from anything resembling civilization. Calder had looked at the photos for maybe 10 minutes before making the call. Something about the ruin spoke to him in a language he understood too well. His former life felt like it belonged to someone else now. 23 years ago, he'd been a promising young architect in Denver, full of ideas and ambition. He'd met Vivian in a coffee shop near campus. She was studying literature, he was drowning in blueprints, and somehow they'd built a life together. 22 years of marriage, 22 years of thinking they'd figured it out. But marriages don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly, like riverbanks wearing away grain by grain, until one day you look across the bed and realize the person lying there is a stranger. Or maybe you're the stranger. Calder still wasn't sure which. The recession had hit his firm hard. Projects dried up, clients disappeared, and the partnership he'd spent 15 years building dissolved in a series of tense meetings and legal documents. By the time the dust settled, he had nothing left but debt and the distant memory of who he used to be. Vivian had tried to be supportive. He could give her that. But watching your husband unravel is one thing. Living with the shell of who he used to be is another. The conversation, when it finally came, was quiet, almost gentle. "I don't love you anymore," she'd said, sitting at their kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "I'm sorry. I wish I did. But I don't," Calder had nodded, feeling nothing, or everything. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. The divorce was civil. She kept the house. Or rather, the bank kept the house, and she kept the responsibility of dealing with it. They split what little remained in their accounts. Their daughter, Maren, 26 and living in Scotland, had taken the news with a mixture of sadness and relief. Maybe she'd been waiting for them to finally admit what she'd already known. "At least you're both being honest now," she'd said over a crackling video call. But Calder had heard the disappointment underneath her words. The sense that both her parents had somehow failed at the most basic adult task. Staying together. The months after the divorce blurred together. He'd rented a small apartment, taken odd jobs, drifted through days without purpose. Sawyer had been his only constant. A rescue dog he'd adopted 2 years earlier, back when he still thought having a pet might help fill the spaces opening up in his marriage. The dog had watched him fall apart, with those worried eyes, staying close, asking nothing. Then one night, scrolling through property listings he couldn't afford, Calder found the cabin. 5 acres in western Montana, backing up to national forest, miles from the nearest town. The photos showed the damage clearly. The fire had gutted most of the interior, left the structure compromised but standing. It would take months of work to make it livable. Maybe longer. He'd bought it anyway, draining what remained of his savings. His brother thought he'd lost his mind. Maren had been cautiously concerned. Vivian, when he told her, had simply said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." He wasn't looking for anything. That was the point. Now, 3 weeks into his new life, Calder had established a routine. Wake with the sun, make coffee on the camp stove he'd set up outside, assess the day's work. The main room had been his first priority, clearing debris, checking the structural integrity of the walls and floor joists. To his relief, the fire had been contained mostly to the roof and the back section. The front of the cabin, while damaged by smoke and water, was salvageable. He worked alone methodically, hauled out burned timber, swept up ash and broken glass, sorted through the remnants of whoever had lived here before. There wasn't much. A few charred pieces of furniture, some melted kitchen items, fragments of a life interrupted. He'd found a set of fireplace tools, their handles burned away but the iron intact. A cast-iron skillet warped from heat. Small relics that told him nothing about their owner. The physical labor helped. Each morning his body ached from the previous day's work, and that ache was honest, real. It gave him something to focus on besides the wreckage of his own life. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion would set in and his mind would quiet. He'd make simple meals, sandwiches, canned soup, anything that didn't require thought, and eat while sitting on the front steps. Sawyer pressed against his leg. The Montana wilderness stretched out before him in every direction. Towering pines, their needles whispering in the constant breeze. Mountains in the distance, their peaks still holding snow even in late spring. The air tasted clean in a way that city air never had, sharp and pure, and somehow ancient. At night, the silence was so complete, it felt like a physical presence. He'd made one trip to town for supplies, a 40-minute drive to a place called Helena, population just under 30,000. The hardware store clerk had been friendly, in that careful way rural people have with newcomers. Calder had kept the conversation brief, paid cash, and left. He wasn't ready for questions about where he came from or what brought him here. Back at the cabin, he'd replaced 2 window frames, patched sections of the floor, and managed to get the old wood stove working again. Progress came in inches, but it came. Each small repair felt like a minor victory against entropy. Evenings were the hardest. After the work stopped and dinner was finished, he'd sit on the steps and watch the sun disappear behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible. That's when the thoughts would creep in, memories of Vivian, of Maren as a child, of the life he'd built and lost. The wedding ring still hung on a chain around his neck, hidden under his shirt. He couldn't bring himself to take it off, but he couldn't bear to wear it properly either. "What do you think, Sawyer?" He'd ask the dog, who would thump his tail without judgment. "Think we can make this work?" The dog never answered, but his presence was enough. Calder had just turned 53, old enough to know better, young enough to maybe start over. Though starting over implied moving towards something, and he was simply existing, rebuilding a cabin because it gave him something to do. Because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering everything he'd lost. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, he'd find himself wondering about the previous owner. Who had lived here? What had happened to cause the fire? The real estate agent had been vague. Something about an estate sale, property tied up for years, no one wanting to deal with it. Sawyer had been acting strange lately. The dog would stare at certain spots around the cabin, hackles raised slightly, emitting low growls that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Calder dismissed it as animal instinct, probably mice in the walls, or the scent of whatever wildlife passed through at night. Bears, maybe? Mountain lions. The forest was full of things that moved in darkness. He told himself the unease he sometimes felt was just the strangeness of being alone in such an isolated place. The way sounds carried differently through the trees, the shadows that seemed longer, deeper. He'd get used to it. Give it time. Time was one thing he had plenty of now. As he settled in for another night, Calder felt something he hadn't expected. a strange sense of rightness. This broken place, miles from anyone, suited him. The parallel wasn't lost on him, a burned cabin being rebuilt by a burned-out man. Maybe they could fix each other. Or maybe they'd just exist together in their mutual ruin. Either way, he was exactly where he needed to be, even if he didn't yet understand why. The morning started like any other. Rain rolled in from the west, steady and cold, turning the clearing around the cabin into mud. Calder spent those days working inside, tackling the smoke-damaged walls. The work was tedious, scrubbing soot, sanding blackened wood, assessing what could be saved and what needed replacing. He'd set up a simple sleeping area in the one corner of the main room that felt most secure. A camping mattress, sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern. His clothes hung from nails driven into the wall studs. Books he'd brought but hadn't touched sat stacked beside his makeshift bed. The space was Spartan, almost monastic, and that suited him fine. He didn't need comfort. He needed purpose. During the rain, he found himself thinking more about the previous owner. Small clues emerged as he worked. Pencil marks on a door frame, like someone had been measuring something. A quote carved into one of the windowsills, barely visible under the soot. In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. Camus, whoever had lived here, read philosophy. One afternoon, while prying up a section of damaged flooring, Calder discovered something wedged between the joists. A photograph, water-stained and faded but recognizable. It showed a man and woman, probably in their 60s, standing on what looked like this very porch before the fire. They were smiling, his arm around her shoulders, her head leaning against his chest. Behind them, the cabin stood whole and welcoming. Calder studied their faces. The man had weathered features, grey hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The woman was smaller, delicate, with silver hair pulled back and a smile that seemed to hold some private joy. They looked like people who'd lived full lives, who'd earned their contentment. He set the photograph on the windowsill, where he'd found the Camus quote. They belonged together somehow, the words and the image, evidence of someone who'd tried to find meaning in this isolated place. The wedding ring around his neck felt heavier that day. He'd taken it off his finger 2 years ago when it became clear the marriage was ending, but couldn't bring himself to put it away completely. The chain was a compromise, keeping Vivian close but not too close. Sometimes he forgot he was wearing it. Other times, like now, it felt like it weighed 10 pounds. He'd tried calling Maren twice since arriving in Montana. Both times the calls went to voicemail. He'd left brief messages, just wanted you to know I'm settling in. The cabin's a project, but it's coming along. Love you. She'd responded with text messages, short, polite, distant. He understood. She was building her own life across the ocean, and he'd been largely absent from it for the past 2 years, drowning in his own problems. The truth was, he'd failed her. Not catastrophically, not in any single dramatic way, but through 1,000 small absences, missed calls, delayed responses. The inability to be present even when they were in the same room, because his mind was stuck on everything falling apart. She deserved better. Both women in his life had deserved better than what he'd been capable of giving. By the time the rain stopped, Calder had made significant progress on the interior. The main room was cleared of debris, the walls cleaned, the damaged sections of floor replaced with new lumber. It still smelled of smoke and damp, but it was beginning to feel like a space someone could live in, rather than a disaster zone. He'd also begun to notice patterns in Sawyer's behavior. The dog was particularly fixated on the western corner of the cabin, near where the floor met the foundation. Several times Calder had found him there, nose pressed to the floorboards, whining softly. Once he'd started digging at the wood, claws scraping insistently, until Calder called him away. "What's got into you?" Calder had asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. Sawyer had looked at him with those worried eyes, then back at the floor, as if trying to communicate something important. Probably mice, or the scent of whatever creature had denned there before the fire. Dogs were sensitive to things humans couldn't detect. Still, the persistence was unusual. Sawyer had never been an anxious dog, never obsessive about anything except meal times and walks. On a particularly clear evening, Calder walked the property boundary. 5 acres wasn't much, but it felt like a kingdom out here. The land sloped gently downward behind the cabin, thick with pine and Douglas fir. A small creek ran through the eastern edge, the water so cold it made his hands ache when he tested it. Deer trails crisscrossed the underbrush. Once he spotted an elk in the distance, moving like a ghost between the trees. This land had history. He could feel it in the old-growth trees, in the moss-covered stones, in the way the light filtered through the canopy. People had probably lived here for thousands of years before the cabin was built. Hunters, trappers, maybe homesteaders, trying to carve out a life from wilderness. They'd all left traces. A rusted tin can half buried in leaves, an old barbed wire fence overtaken by forest, stones stacked in ways that suggested human hands. The cabin itself couldn't be more than 20 or 30 years old, judging by the construction style and materials. Someone had built it by hand, that much was clear. The joints were careful, the placement deliberate. Not professional work, but done by someone who cared about getting it right. The fire had obscured a lot, but the bones of the structure showed pride in craftsmanship. That night, Calder sat on the front steps long after dark, wrapped in a heavy jacket against the cold. The stars were impossible out here, thousands of them. The Milky Way, a bright river overhead. He'd forgotten stars could look like this. In Denver, light pollution reduced the night sky to a handful of bright points. Here the universe displayed itself in full glory. Sawyer lay beside him, warm and solid. The dog had finally settled, no longer fixating on that corner of the cabin. Maybe whatever had bothered him was gone. Or maybe he'd just accepted it, the way dogs accept most things eventually. You know what the problem is, Calder said quietly, more to himself than the dog. I don't know who I am anymore. Spent my whole adult life being someone's husband, someone's father, someone's business partner. Now I'm none of those things. So who am I? Sawyer's tail thumped once against the wooden step. Yeah, I'm your person. That's something, I guess. The forest whispered around them, branches moving in the breeze, small creatures rustling through underbrush, the distant call of an owl. Calder had never been comfortable with silence before. In the city, there was always noise, traffic, neighbors, the hum of electricity and human activity. He'd kept the television on in his apartment just to fill the space, even when he wasn't watching it, but this silence was different. It wasn't empty, it was full of wind and water and living things going about their business, full of time moving at a different pace, full of something he didn't have words for yet, but was beginning to understand. Maybe he'd come here to disappear, to fade into the wilderness and stop being anyone at all. But sitting here under these impossible stars, Calder felt the first stirrings of something else. Not hope, exactly. Hope seemed too strong, too bright. But possibility, maybe. The sense that this wasn't an ending. It was something in between. A pause. A held breath before whatever came next. He didn't know yet that tomorrow morning Sawyer would start digging again. That this time the dog wouldn't stop until Calder followed. That beneath the cabin's foundation, buried under ash and earth, waited a story that would change everything he thought he understood about loss, about love, about the courage it takes to keep living when everything you built has burned down. For now, he just sat in the darkness with his dog, feeling the cold air on his face, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. For now, that was enough. 2 days passed in a blur. Calder's work on the cabin slowed to almost nothing as he became absorbed in Benedict Thorne's journal. He read sitting on the porch steps, leaning against the cabin wall, lying on his sleeping bag at night, with a lantern beside him. The pages drew him in like nothing had in years. Benedict's story unfolded in careful detail. He'd been a high school English teacher in Billings, Montana, for 32 years. Taught American literature, poetry, creative writing. His entries mentioned former students, colleagues, the rhythm of academic life, but always, always. They circled back to Iris. They'd met in college, married young, built a life together over 31 years. The journal painted a picture of devotion so complete it made Calder ache. Benedict wrote about ordinary moments elevated by love, morning coffee together, reading aloud to each other on winter evenings, spontaneous road trips to nowhere in particular. Small rituals that became the architecture of a shared life. Iris laughed at my terrible jokes, one entry read. Not because they were funny, but because she loved watching me tell them. That's the difference between liking someone and loving them. Love finds joy in the other person's joy, even when the joke falls flat. Calder had to set the journal down after that passage. When had he last made Vivian laugh? When had he cared about her joy more than his own stress, his own problems? He couldn't remember. That realization sat heavy in his chest. The journal described Iris's death in stark, painful detail. She'd been pruning roses in their garden on a Sunday morning. Benedict had been inside making lunch. He'd called her in, got no response. Went outside to find her collapsed among the flowers. Aneurysm. The doctors said she was likely gone before she hit the ground. No warning, no goodbye, just there one moment and gone the next. I keep thinking about those roses, Benedict wrote. She was doing something she loved. That should comfort me. It doesn't. I'd trade 1,000 peaceful deaths for one more conversation. One more morning, one more chance to say the things I forgot to say. Calder read these entries slowly, feeling the weight of every word. This wasn't just someone else's grief. It was a mirror held up to his own failures. Benedict had lost Iris to death, sudden and absolute. Calder had lost Vivian to neglect, to distance, to the slow erosion of everything they'd built. Different losses, but both left you standing in the wreckage, wondering who you were without the other person. The journal continued through Benedict's first year of grief. He'd tried to return to teaching but couldn't, standing in front of a classroom, talking about themes in The Great Gatsby, felt absurd when his entire world had collapsed. He took early retirement, sold the house in Billings, used the money to buy this land. I'm building a cabin, Benedict wrote. People think I've lost my mind. My brother called 3 times yesterday trying to talk me out of it. But I need to build something. Need to take wooden nails and create something that will stand. If I can make this cabin exist where nothing existed before, maybe I can do the same with my life. Maybe. The entries from the building phase were different, more focused, less raw. Benedict described learning carpentry as he went, making mistakes and fixing them. The satisfaction of seeing walls rise from nothing. He wrote about the forest, the wildlife, the profound silence that both frightened and healed him. Calder had descended back into the cellar to retrieve the photograph albums. Now he studied them alongside the journal entries, putting faces and places to Benedict's words. There were dozens of photos of Iris, hiking, gardening, reading on a porch swing, laughing at something off camera. In every image, she radiated a quiet contentment. Her smile never looked forced, never performed. She'd been genuinely happy. One photograph stopped Calder cold. It showed Iris on a hiking trail, arms spread wide, head thrown back in joy. She was laughing at something, and you could see Benedict's shadow in the foreground. He'd been the one taking the picture, capturing her moment of pure happiness. The image had been taken somewhere in Glacier National Park, according to the note on the back. Iris at her best, Benedict had written. This is how I want to remember her. Calder set the album aside and pressed his palms against his eyes. When had he last seen Vivian look that happy? Had she ever looked at him the way Iris looked at Benedict in these photos, with complete trust, complete openness? The honest answer hurt. Maybe in the beginning. Maybe in those first few years when everything was new and full of promise. But somewhere along the way, they'd stopped looking at each other like that. Started looking past each other or through each other or not looking at all. He returned to the journal. Benedict's entries from year 1 in the cabin showed gradual healing. Not recovery, he was clear about that distinction, but adaptation. Learning to live with the absence rather than being consumed by it. I planted a garden today, one entry read. Iris would have loved this spot. Good southern exposure, rich soil once you get past the pine needles. I'm putting in tomatoes, lettuce, herbs. I'll probably kill most of them. But Iris always said you learn more from the plants that die than the ones that thrive. She was talking about teaching, but it applies to everything. Calder marked that page. Tomorrow, he'd go find that garden plot. It had to be somewhere behind the cabin, probably overgrown now, but still there. The idea of restoring it appealed to him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The journal's second year brought a shift. Benedict mentioned a woman named Constance. The first reference was casual. Ran into a woman at the general store today. Constance. She's new to the area, recently widowed. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. It was the longest conversation I've had in months that wasn't with my brother or the grocery clerk. Over the following entries, Constance appeared more frequently. They'd meet for coffee in town. She visited the cabin once, brought a pie. They went on a hike together. Benedict's writing about her was cautious, almost guilty. I enjoyed her company today, he wrote. We talked about books, about loss, about trying to build new lives from the pieces of old ones. She understands. That's rare. But afterwards I felt like I'd betrayed Iris somehow. Which is absurd. Iris is gone. She'd want me to be happy. I know she would. So why does it feel like infidelity to laugh with someone else? Calder read these entries with growing recognition. The internal battle Benedict described, the guilt of moving forward, the sense that healing somehow dishonored the past, felt intimately familiar. He'd felt the same thing the one time he'd gone on a date after the divorce. A colleague had set him up with a friend, and Calder had spent the entire evening feeling wrong. Not because the woman wasn't pleasant, she was, but because some part of him believed that moving on meant admitting failure. Benedict's entries about Constance became more conflicted. He clearly cared for her, might even have been falling in love, but he couldn't let himself. Every time they grew closer, he'd pull back. Cancel plans. Stop returning her calls for weeks. Then feel guilty about that too. I'm hurting her, Benedict wrote. I can see it in her eyes when I make another excuse, create another wall. She deserves better. She deserves someone who can be fully present, not haunted by ghosts. But I don't know how to be that person. Don't know if I want to be. Eventually, Constance stopped trying. One entry, dated 2 years after Iris's death, saw Constance in town today. She was with friends, laughing at something. She looked right through me. I've lost her, and it's my own fault. I pushed away the one person who might have understood. Now I have the solitude I claimed I wanted. It feels like punishment. Calder closed the journal and stared out at the forest. The parallel was too obvious to miss. He'd been doing the same thing, pushing people away, choosing isolation, telling himself it was what he needed. Marin's calls going to voicemail. His brother's invitations declined. Even Sawyer sometimes got ignored when Calder was too deep in his own head. The difference was that Calder still had time. Marin was still alive, still trying to reach him, even if he made it difficult. He could change course if he chose to. Benedict, according to the journal, had run out of time. The entries from year 3 grew darker. He wrote about insomnia, about drinking more than he should, about days when he couldn't find a reason to get out of bed. The isolation that had seemed healing now felt like a trap. And then the strange occurrences started. Benedict mentioned them matter-of-factly at first. Things keep moving in the cabin. I'm sure it's just me being forgetful, putting down my keys and not remembering where. Finding windows open that I thought I'd closed. Old house settling wind my imagination, but the entries grew more unsettled. Objects going missing and reappearing. Sounds at night that seemed like footsteps. Benedict questioned his sanity, wondered if grief could literally haunt a place. I wonder if grief can haunt a place, he wrote, the words making Calder's skin prickle. If my pain has soaked into these walls like smoke, if Iris is trying to reach me, or if I'm just losing my mind. Either way, I'm not alone here anymore. I'm not sure if that's comfort or terror. Sawyer had been lying at Calder's feet. Now the dog raised his head, ears alert, staring toward the western corner of the cabin, the same spot he'd been fixated on before they found the trap door. You feel it too? Calder asked softly. The dog whined but didn't move. Calder had about a third of the journal left to read. Part of him wanted to rush through, get to the ending, find out what happened to Benedict Thorne. But another part wanted to slow down, honor each entry, walk beside this stranger through every step of his journey. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Calder marked his place in the journal and went inside to start dinner. Simple meal, canned chili, bread and apple. He ate mechanically, his mind still on Benedict's words. That night, lying in his sleeping bag, Calder couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Constance, about the woman Benedict had pushed away. She'd be in her 70s now if she was still alive. Probably still in the area, based on Benedict's references to her living in Helena. What would it mean to find her? To tell her that Benedict had loved her, had regretted losing her, had been too broken to let himself be loved in return. The idea took root. Before he could finish Benedict's story, before he understood the full scope of what had happened here, Calder made a decision. He would find Constance, would deliver whatever closure Benedict's words might offer. It was the least he could do for the man who'd left this journal, this archive, this unexpected lifeline thrown across 15 years from one broken person to another. The next morning, Calder set out to find Benedict's garden. He walked around the cabin's perimeter, Sawyer trotting ahead, until he spotted it, a cleared area about 30 feet behind the structure, partially reclaimed by forest, but still visible. 4 raised beds, constructed from weathered timbers, formed a rectangle. Weeds and wild grasses had overtaken them, but the bones of the garden remained. Calder knelt beside one bed, pulling away the overgrowth. Beneath it, he could see the dark, rich soil Benedict had cultivated. Even after all these years, it looked different from the surrounding earth. Looser, more carefully tended. The journal had described this place with such care. Benedict had written about each plant, each season, the satisfaction of nurturing something living. For him, it had been therapy, a way to feel connected to growth when everything in his life felt like decay. Calder made a decision. He'd restore this garden, clear the beds, plant new vegetables and herbs, continue what Benedict had started. The symbolism wasn't lost on him, cultivating life from land touched by loss. But beyond symbolism, it felt right. It felt like honoring something worth honoring. He spent the morning clearing the first bed, pulling weeds, turning soil. The physical work felt good, grounding. Sawyer explored the area, occasionally returning to check on Calder before wandering off again. The dog seemed calmer today, less fixated on the cabin's corner. Maybe finding the trapdoor had satisfied whatever instinct had been driving him. By noon, Calder had cleared 2 beds and worked up a solid appetite. He went inside, made lunch, then returned to the journal. He was in the final year of Benedict's entries now, and the tone had shifted again, darker, more fragmented. Benedict was forgetting things. Small stuff at first, where he'd put his reading glasses, whether he'd eaten breakfast, what day of the week it was. He attributed it to age, to isolation, to drinking too much in the evenings. But the entries showed growing concern. Lost 3 hours today, one passage read. I was working on the porch. Then suddenly it was dark, and I was inside with no memory of coming in. I'm scared. This isn't normal forgetting. Something's wrong. The handwriting began to deteriorate. Words scratched out and rewritten. Sentences that trailed off mid-thought. Benedict wrote about confusion, about moments where he couldn't remember where he was, or why he was there, and then the entries that made Calder's blood run cold. Iris was here today. I know that's impossible. I know she's dead. But I heard her voice calling from the bedroom. When I went to look, the bed was made the way she always made it. Hospital corners, pillows, just so. I haven't made the bed in 3 years. Another entry dated 2 weeks later. She's here more often now. I see her in the garden, in the kitchen, sitting in her chair by the window. Sometimes she looks at me, and I can tell she doesn't recognize me. Other times she smiles like she used to. I don't know what's real anymore. Calder felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. This wasn't grief or loneliness. This was illness. Benedict's mind had been failing, creating hallucinations of the person he'd lost. The strange occurrences he'd written about earlier weren't supernatural. They were symptoms of something medical, probably neurological. He kept reading, though part of him didn't want to. The entries became more disjointed, harder to follow. Benedict wrote about Iris being alive, about taking care of her, about conversations they'd had. Then suddenly he'd snap back to awareness, recognizing that none of it was real, that he was alone and losing himself. Called my brother today. One entry read in shaky handwriting. Told him what's happening. He's coming next week. Says we need to see doctors. I know what they'll say. I've seen this before. My mother had it. Alzheimer's, early onset, aggressive. I'm 58 years old, and my mind is leaving me. Calder set the journal down, pressing his hands to his face. The tragedy deepened with every page. Benedict hadn't just lost Iris, he'd lost himself afterward. Had spent his final coherent months watching his own mind deteriorate, knowing what was coming. The next few entries were dated weeks apart. Benedict's brother had visited, arranged for medical evaluations. The diagnosis was confirmed. Early onset Alzheimer's, progressing rapidly. Benedict wrote about the decision to move to Oregon, to a care facility where his brother could visit regularly. I don't want to leave this place, Benedict wrote. I built it with my own hands. Iris never saw it, but I feel her here anyway. Leaving feels like abandoning her all over again. But I can't stay. Can't risk hurting myself or burning the place down because I forgot the stove was on. My brother is right. It's time to go. One of the final coherent entries outlined Benedict's plans. He'd packed his most precious belongings, the photographs, letters, personal items, and hidden them in the cellar. The property would be sold, the proceeds going toward his care. He'd written a letter to whoever eventually bought the place, hoping someone might find his story and understand. If you're reading this, you're probably broken too, Benedict wrote. That's okay. Broken things can still hold beauty. I learned that from Iris, from these woods, from the process of building something from nothing. Don't give up. Don't do what I did. Don't push away the people who care. Let yourself be loved while you still can. The final dated entry was barely legible. Brother arrives tomorrow. Last night in the cabin. I can hear Iris calling. Maybe it's time to go home. After that, nothing. The remaining pages were blank. Calder sat for a long time, staring at those empty pages. He wanted more. Wanted to know what happened in Oregon, how long Benedict lived, whether he found any peace at the end. But the story stopped here at this cabin, with a man preparing to leave the only place he'd found meaning after loss. He needed to know the rest. That afternoon, Calder drove into Helena. The town was bigger than he'd expected, not quite a city, but more than a rural outpost. He found the library easily enough, a modern building with helpful staff and good internet access. The librarian, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, directed him to the newspaper archives. Looking for anything specific? Obituary, Calder said. Man named Benedict Thorne. Would have died maybe 7 or 8 years ago, possibly in Oregon. She helped him set up the database search. 20 minutes later, Calder found it. Benedict Thorne, 65, formerly of Billings, Montana, passed away peacefully on March 14th, 7 years ago, at Evergreen Care Center in Portland, Oregon. Benedict was a beloved high school English teacher who inspired countless students during his 32-year career. He is survived by his brother, Peter Thorne, of Eugene, Oregon. No other surviving family. Memorial services were private. The obituary was brief, impersonal. It mentioned his teaching career, but nothing about Iris, nothing about the cabin, nothing about the man who'd poured his heart into those journal pages. Just the clinical facts of a life reduced to a few sentences, but one detail stood out. He died in Oregon, in a care facility. His brother had followed through, had taken care of him at the end. That was something. Calder expanded his search, looking for property records. Found the sale of the Montana property to a mining company 6 years ago. Then 5 years ago, a fire report. Structure fire at 1847 Pine Ridge Road. Cause undetermined, likely accidental. Property abandoned, no injuries reported. The cabin had burned a year after Benedict's death. No investigation, just an insurance write-off. The mining company had let it go, eventually selling it to the bank, which finally sold it to Calder. He sat back, processing. The timeline made sense now. Benedict had left. The property changed hands. Something caused the fire, lightning maybe, or vagrant campers, and the place sat empty and damaged until Calder bought it. But what about Constance? He searched for her next, trying variations of the name with Helena, Montana. Nothing in the obituaries, which meant she was probably still alive. But without a last name, finding her would be difficult. Calder approached the librarian again. Long shot, but I'm trying to find someone. Woman named Constance, would be in her 70s, lived in Helena about 10 to 15 years ago, recently widowed at that time. The librarian considered. That's not much to go on, but Helena's not that big. Do you know what she did for work? Calder shook his head, then remembered something from the journal. Wait, Benedict mentioned meeting her at the general store. She was new to the area. Might try the Historical Society, the librarian suggested. They keep records of long-time residents, community members. Or you could check with some of the churches. They tend to know people. Calder thanked her and left. It was late afternoon now, too late to track down the Historical Society. But he had a plan. Tomorrow he'd come back, ask around, find this woman who'd loved Benedict and been pushed away, driving home. Calder thought about Benedict's words. Don't do what I did. Don't push away the people who care. When he got back to the cabin, he pulled out his phone. Stared at Maren's last text message from 3 weeks ago. Dad, just checking in. Hope the cabin project is going well. Love you. He'd responded with a single sentence. All good here. Talk soon. That wasn't good enough. Not anymore. He typed a longer message. Maren, I'm sorry I've been so distant. You deserve better. I've been working through some things here, and I've realized I've been doing exactly what I told myself I wouldn't do. Shutting out the people who matter. Can we talk this week? Really talk? I want to hear about your life, about Scotland, about everything I've been too self-absorbed to ask about. I love you. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to say it properly. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came 10 minutes later. Dad, yes. Please call tomorrow evening, my time. I've missed you. Calder felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for too long. It hurt, but it was a good hurt. The kind that comes from thawing after being frozen. That night, he sat on the porch with Sawyer, the journal in his lap. He'd finished reading it, knew Benedict's story as well as his own now. Two men, both broken by loss, both choosing isolation. But Benedict's story had ended in a care facility, his mind gone, his chance at connection with Constance lost forever. Calder's story was still being written. He could choose differently. He would choose differently. Thank you, he said quietly to Benedict, to the forest, to whatever force had led him to this place. Thank you for showing me what not to do. Tomorrow he'd find Constance. He'd deliver Benedict's message, the apology written between the lines of every journal entry. And then he'd keep choosing, keep reaching out instead of pulling away, keep building instead of hiding. The cabin restoration could wait. People couldn't. 3 days later, Calder returned to the cellar. He'd been putting it off, uncertain whether he should disturb Benedict's carefully preserved belongings any further. But he needed to find something, anything, that might lead him to Constance. He descended the wooden steps, flashlight in hand. The space felt different now, less mysterious and more sacred. This was Benedict's archive, his deliberate attempt to preserve what mattered most. Calder went through the photograph albums more carefully this time, looking for clues. Most images showed Benedict and Iris at various stages of their life together. But toward the back of the third album, he found something different. A small envelope tucked between pages, easy to miss. Inside was a locket, gold delicate, tarnished with age. He opened it carefully. On one side, a tiny portrait of a young woman. Iris, he assumed, though the photo was old enough that it might have been her grandmother. On the other side, a lock of silver hair tied with thread. Beneath the locket was a letter, folded small. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but readable. It was from Iris to Benedict, dated before their marriage. My dearest Ben, it began. You asked what I wanted for our wedding, and I told you I wanted nothing but you. But my grandmother insisted I take this locket. It's been in our family for 3 generations. She said every marriage needs something old to remind us where we came from, and something precious to remind us where we're going. This is both. Wear it close to your heart, and know that wherever you go, I'm with you. Always, Iris. Calder held the locket gently, feeling the weight of its significance. This had been given with such love, such certainty about the future. He could imagine Benedict wearing it or keeping it close, a talisman against loneliness. He placed it carefully on the desk beside the journal, then turned his attention to the letters bundled with string. Most were cards and notes between Benedict and Iris. Birthday wishes, anniversary messages, simple expressions of affection from the daily routine of a long marriage. But one bundle was different. The return address showed a Helena post office box, and the handwriting wasn't Iris's. These letters were from Constance. Calder's hands trembled slightly as he untied the string. There were maybe a dozen letters, all sent during a 6-month period about 13 years ago. He opened the first one. "Dear Benedict, thank you for the coffee yesterday. It's been so long since I've had a conversation that felt real, where I didn't have to pretend to be fine, didn't have to perform grief in the way people expect. You understand what this is like? That's rare and precious. I hope we can do it again soon. Warmly, Constance." The letters progressed from friendly to something deeper. Constance wrote about her late husband, about the hollowness of widowhood, about trying to rebuild a life that felt worth living. Her words were elegant, thoughtful, sometimes achingly sad. "I think I'm falling in love with you," one letter read. "I didn't think that was possible anymore. After Gerald died, I assumed that part of my life was finished. But then you happened, this wounded, wonderful man who makes me laugh despite everything. I don't need you to say it back. I don't need promises. I just needed you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." Calder had to stop reading. The intimacy of these words, the vulnerability, it felt like trespassing. But he continued, because he needed to understand what had happened between them. The later letters showed confusion, hurt. "You haven't returned my calls in 3 weeks. If you need space, please just tell me. The uncertainty is harder than any answer would be. And then, I understand now. You're not ready, may never be ready. I won't contact you again. I hope you find peace, Benedict. You deserve it even if you don't believe that." The final letter was brief. "I heard you're leaving Montana. I hope Oregon treats you kindly. Despite everything, I'm grateful for the time we had. You showed me I could feel again. That's a gift, even if it hurts right now. Take care of yourself. See." Calder sat back, the letters in his lap. The story was clearer now, sadder. Constance had loved Benedict genuinely, had offered him a chance at connection, and he'd pushed her away, too trapped in his grief and guilt to accept what she offered. By the time his illness forced him to leave, it was too late. But Constance had survived it, had been strong enough to walk away when Benedict couldn't meet her halfway. Calder respected that, even as his heart broke for both of them. He gathered the letters, the locket, and the journal. These things belonged together. They told a complete story. And Constance deserved to have them, to know that Benedict had treasured what they'd shared, even as he'd been unable to fully embrace it. Now he just had to find her. Back at the cabin, Calder called the Helena Historical Society. A cheerful woman named Ruth answered, listened to his somewhat awkward explanation. "I'm trying to find someone who lived in Helena about 10 to 15 years ago. First name Constance, probably in her 60s or 70s now. She was widowed. Husband's name might have been Gerald. Constance Bellamy," Ruth said immediately. "Has to be. She's the only Constance I know who fits that description. Lost her husband Gerald maybe 15 years back. Lovely woman." Calder's heart jumped. "Is she still in the area?" "Oh, yes. Lives in a small house on Maple Street. Number 47, I believe. Keeps to herself mostly, but she's active in the library's book club. I see her there once a month." "Thank you," Calder said, relief flooding through him. "Thank you so much." He spent the rest of the day preparing. Cleaned the locket carefully, organized the letters in chronological order, wrote a note explaining who he was and how he'd found Benedict's belongings. He wanted to approach this right, didn't want to cause Constance unnecessary pain by showing up unannounced with ghosts from her past. That evening, he called Maren as promised. The conversation was awkward at first. They'd spent so long communicating in brief, surface-level exchanges that genuine talk felt unfamiliar. But slowly, they found their rhythm. She told him about her work at a publishing house in Edinburgh, about the Scottish boyfriend she'd been seeing for 8 months, about the flat she shared with 2 roommates near the city centre. Her life was full busy, exactly what a 26-year-old's life should be. "You sound different, Dad," she said after they'd talked for nearly an hour. "More present, I am," he said. "Or I'm trying to be. I've been reading this journal. Long story, I'll tell you sometime. And it's made me realize how much time I've wasted hiding from people who care about me." "I'm glad," she said softly. "I've missed you. Not the version of you that went through the motions, but the actual you. The dad who used to take me hiking, who taught me about architecture by building elaborate sand castles, who made terrible jokes at breakfast." Calder felt his throat tighten. "I've missed that version of me too. I'm working on finding him again." "Take your time," Marin said. "Just don't disappear on me again, okay?" "I won't, I promise." After they hung up, Calder sat on the porch watching the sunset. Sawyer lay beside him, the dog's head resting on his thigh. The forest was alive with evening sounds, birds settling for the night, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. He thought about Benedict's words, "Don't push away the people who care." Tomorrow he'd drive to Maple Street, knock on Constance Bellamy's door, and deliver the message Benedict had been too broken to deliver himself. It wouldn't undo the past, wouldn't give either of them back the years they'd lost. But it might offer closure, might let Constance know she hadn't been wrong to love him, that Benedict had loved her back, even if he'd been unable to show it. And maybe, in delivering that message, Calder would learn something about his own capacity for courage, about choosing connection over safety, about risking the vulnerability that comes with letting people in. The wedding ring was still in his pocket. He pulled it out, held it up to the fading light. It caught the sunset, glinted gold and copper. For 2 years, he'd carried this symbol of failure, of loss, of everything he'd once believed in, and watched crumble. But maybe it didn't have to mean that. Maybe it could simply be what it was, a marker of time spent, lessons learned, a chapter that had ended to make room for whatever came next. He didn't bury it or throw it away. Instead, he went inside and placed it in a small wooden box he'd found in the cabin. One of Benedict's, probably, left behind in the fire. The ring settled among other small objects, a bent nail from the first floorboard he'd replaced, a river stone Sawyer had brought him, a dried flower from the garden bed he'd cleared, artifacts of his time here. Evidence of slow rebuilding. The box went on a shelf, visible but not central. Part of the story, but not the whole story. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own small acts of courage. For tonight he'd done enough. He'd reached out to his daughter. He'd decided to deliver closure to a stranger. He'd put away the symbol of his past and chosen to focus on his present. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes something is exactly enough. Calder stood on the porch of 47 Maple Street for a full 5 minutes before knocking. The house was modest, well-maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a small garden out front. Wind chimes hung near the door, their soft melody filling the quiet morning. He'd brought everything, the locket, the letters, Benedict's journal. They were wrapped carefully in cloth, tucked into a canvas bag. His note of introduction was folded on top, explaining who he was and how he'd found these things. Finally he knocked. Footsteps approached from inside, slow and measured. The door opened, to reveal a woman in her early 70s, silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing a cardigan over a simple dress. Her face was lined but lovely, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cultured, careful. "Miss Bellamy? Constance Bellamy?" "Yes." Wariness crept into her expression. "My name is Calder. I bought a property outside of town, a burned cabin that used to belong to Benedict Thorne. I found some things I think you should have." The change in her face was immediate. Color drained from her cheeks, her hand gripped the doorframe. "Benedict," she whispered, "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced. I know this must be—" "Come in," she said, stepping back. "But please," her home was filled with books. They lined every wall, stacked on tables, filled the spaces between furniture. A reading chair sat by the window, sunlight streaming across its worn cushions. Tea things were set out on a small table, as if she'd been expecting company. "I was just making tea," she said, her voice unsteady. "Would you? That would be lovely." "Thank you." She disappeared into the kitchen. Calder heard the sound of water running, cups being set out, the small domestic noises that gave her time to collect herself. He remained standing, not wanting to presume. When she returned carrying a tray, her composure had mostly returned, though her hands still trembled slightly. They sat across from each other, the canvas bag between them like a living thing. "How long has it been since you've heard about Benedict?" Calder asked gently. 13 years since we last spoke. 7 years since I learned he'd died." She poured tea with careful precision. "I tried to visit him in Oregon near the end. His brother told me it wouldn't help, that Benedict didn't remember anyone anymore, barely knew his own name. I wrote letters anyway." "Never sent them." "I found your letters," Calder said. "The ones you sent when he was still at the cabin. They were preserved in a cellar beneath the house, along with other things he treasured." Her eyes filled with tears. "He kept them?" "He kept everything that mattered to him. Your letters. Photographs of his wife Iris, his journal." Calder opened the bag, began removing items carefully. "He wrote about you, about loving you, about being too broken to accept what you offered." Constance's hands shook as she reached for the first bundle of letters, her own words, returned to her across the years. She didn't open them, just held them against her chest. "I loved him," she said quietly. "Not the way he loved Iris. I understood I could never be that for him. But I loved who he was trying to become. I would have settled for whatever he could give me, but he couldn't even give himself permission to try." Calder handed her Benedict's journal. He explains it here. "The guilt, the fear, the sense that moving forward meant betraying Iris's memory. And then his illness, he developed Alzheimer's. Early onset, aggressive. By his final year in the cabin, he was having hallucinations, losing time. That's why he left, why his brother took him to Oregon." She opened the journal, reading Benedict's handwriting with trembling fingers. Tears fell freely now, dripping onto the pages. "I didn't know. I thought he simply didn't want me. That I wasn't enough. You were enough," Calder said firmly. "He wrote about you with such tenderness. About your kindness, your patience, the way you made him laugh. He pushed you away because he was terrified of failing you the way he felt he'd failed Iris, by not being there at the end, by not saying goodbye. His guilt was irrational, but absolute." They sat in silence while Constance read selected passages. Calder watched emotions play across her face: grief, recognition, relief, regret. The validation of knowing she hadn't been wrong, mixed with the sadness of what might have been. Finally, he handed her the locket. This was Iris's, a family heirloom. Benedict treasured it. "I think he'd want you to have it now." Constance opened the locket, studied the portrait and lock of hair. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But why give it to me?" "Because you loved him too. Because you were part of his story, even if it didn't end the way either of you hoped. Because you deserved better than the silence he gave you. And this is all I can offer in its place." She held the locket for a long time, then carefully placed it around her neck. The gold rested against her cardigan, a small weight carrying enormous meaning. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do this. You could have kept these things or thrown them away. But you tracked me down, brought them to me." "Why?" Calder considered the question. "Because I'm a lot like Benedict. I lost my marriage, my career, everything I'd built. I bought that cabin to hide, just like he did. And I was pushing away the people who cared about me, my daughter, my family, the same way Benedict pushed you away." Reading his journal was like looking into a mirror. "I saw where that path leads, and I didn't want to end up there. So this is as much for you as for me," Constance said, not unkindly. "Maybe, yes. I needed to believe that it's not too late to choose differently." "It's not," she said firmly. "I was angry at Benedict for years, hurt, but I survived it. Built a life here, teaching, reading, my book club, my garden. I never remarried, but I've had friendships, purpose, small joys. Loss doesn't have to destroy you if you don't let it." They talked for hours. Constance shared memories of Benedict, his gentle humor, his love of poetry, the way he'd quote Thoreau while hiking. She showed Calder the unsent letters she'd written during his final illness, beautiful expressions of forgiveness and understanding that Benedict had never received. "Would you like to visit the cabin?" Calder asked as he was preparing to leave. "See where he lived, where he found his peace?" Constance's eyes brightened. "I would love that. I never saw it before. He always met me in town. I think he was protecting his space, or maybe protecting me from his isolation. But yes, I'd very much like to see it now." They made plans for the following week. As Calder drove home, he felt lighter somehow. Delivering Benedict's message hadn't undone the past, but it had brought a kind of closure for Constance and for himself. That evening, his phone rang. Maren. "Dad, I have news," she said, excitement in her voice. "We're getting married. Next summer in Scotland. And I want you there. Not just there. I want you to walk me down the aisle." Calder felt emotion well up in his throat. "I'd be honored, sweetheart. Truly honored. There's more," she said, hesitant now. "Mom will be there too, with her new partner. His name is Gregory. They've been together for about a year. I know that might be hard for you." "It's fine," Calder said, surprised to find he meant it. "I'm happy she found someone. We both deserve to move forward. Dad, who are you, and what have you done with my father?" Maren laughed, but there was relief underneath. "I've been dreading telling you this. I'm just someone who's learning from other people's mistakes," Calder said. "Someone who's trying not to waste any more time on resentment or regret." After they hung up, Calder walked outside. The garden beds he'd cleared were ready for planting. Tomorrow he'd drive to the nursery, buy seedlings and seeds, continue Benedict's work of cultivating life from loss. Sawyer followed him to the garden, tail wagging contentedly. The dog had stopped his anxious behaviors completely, as if finding the trapdoor and its secrets had satisfied some deep need. They stood together in the gathering dusk, man and dog, both settling into this place. A neighbor's truck pulled up the driveway, an old Chevy, weathered and well-used. An elderly man climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone in their late 70s. "Heard someone bought the old Thorn place," the man called out, approaching with an extended hand. "Name's Shepherd Crane, own the property to the east. Thought I'd come introduce myself, see if you need any help with repairs." Calder shook his hand, grateful for the gesture. "Calder, and yes, I could use some advice. The cabin's coming along, but there's a lot I don't know." They talked on the porch over coffee, Shepherd sharing what he knew about Benedict. Good man, carried a heavy load. After his wife passed, he was never quite the same. Built this place with his own hands, every board and nail. Saw him working sometimes, early mornings or late evenings. He had help at first, but mostly did it alone. "Did you know about Constance?" Calder asked. Shepherd nodded slowly. "Saw her visit a few times. Could tell there was something between them. But Benedict couldn't let himself be happy after tragedy. Lots of folks are like that. Think suffering is loyalty to what they lost." The words settled into Calder like stones. "That's exactly right. Suffering as loyalty. You seem like you might understand that particular trap," Shepherd observed. "I do. I'm trying to climb out of it." "Good man," Shepherd said, standing to leave. "You need anything, tools, advice, just company, I'm 10 minutes down the road. Don't be a stranger." After Shepherd left, Calder sat alone with his thoughts. The wedding ring was still in its box on the shelf. Vivian was moving on with someone new. Maren was getting married. Benedict's story had ended, but Constance had survived and built a life worth living. Everything was changing, had already changed, and somehow, miraculously, Calder was okay with that. A week after meeting Constance, Calder was working in the cellar, installing shelving to properly organize what remained of Benedict's belongings. The space had become almost comfortable. He'd brought down a work light, swept the floor, organized the crates. Sawyer lay at the top of the stairs, content to supervise rather than descend. The dog's earlier anxiety about this place had vanished completely, replaced by calm acceptance. Calder was measuring the back wall for shelving when his hand brushed against something odd. One of the stones felt different, looser than the others, the mortar around it crumbling. He pushed against it experimentally, and it shifted inward. His pulse quickened. He examined the surrounding stones more carefully. Several were mortared differently, the joints less precise than the rest of the wall. Someone had deliberately constructed this section to look permanent while keeping it accessible. Working carefully, he removed the loose stones one by one, stacking them beside him. Behind them, a cavity opened up, a hidden space about a foot square, deliberately carved into the wall. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in plastic, was another journal. Calder's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. The leather was different from Benedict's journal, softer, more worn. When he opened to the first page, his world tilted. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, and the name written inside made his breath catch, Private Thoughts of Iris Thorne. But that was impossible. Iris had died years before Benedict built this cabin. The journal couldn't be hers, except it was. He checked the dates on the first entry. They were from Iris's final year, not the year she supposedly died, but a year later. A year when Benedict was already at the cabin. Calder sat down hard on the cellar floor, the journal in his lap. With shaking hands, he began to read. Benedict told everyone I died, the first entry began. In a way, I suppose I did. The woman I was is gone. What remains is something else. Someone who forgets more each day, who loses pieces of herself like sand through fingers. We decided together that this was better. A clean break. Let people grieve. Let them move on. Spare them from watching me fade. The truth crashed over Calder like a wave. Iris hadn't died suddenly from an aneurysm. That had been a lie. A story Benedict told to give them privacy, to spare her the indignity of public decline. He read on, unable to stop. Iris's entries described her diagnosis, early-onset Alzheimer's, aggressive and swift. She'd been 57 when symptoms started. By 58, she was forgetting appointments, losing words, struggling with familiar tasks. The doctors gave her 3 to 5 years. We decided to build the cabin together, she wrote. Somewhere remote where I can fade with dignity. Where Benedict won't have to watch me deteriorate in front of colleagues and friends who'll treat me like I'm already gone. He'll tell everyone I died. We'll have a memorial service, then we'll disappear to Montana, and he'll take care of me until the end. Calder's vision blurred with tears. The entire story he thought he knew was wrong. Benedict hadn't come here to escape grief. He'd come here to love Iris through her dying. Every board he'd hammered, every window he'd installed, had been for her. The wheelchair ramp, the bedroom on the main floor, all of it carefully designed for a wife who was losing herself but deserved to do so, surrounded by beauty and love. Iris's journal documented their 2 years together at the cabin. The entries grew shorter, more fragmented, as her disease progressed. She wrote about good days, when she remembered Benedict's face, his name, their history, and bad days, when she woke up terrified, not knowing where she was or who this kind stranger was, who kept calling her darling. Today I forgot him completely. One entry read in shaky handwriting. Fought him when he tried to help me dress. Called him terrible names. By evening I remembered again, and the shame nearly killed me. But Benedict just held me and said, "It's okay. I know you. Even when you don't know me, I know you." The strange occurrences Benedict had written about in his journal. Items moved, sounds at night. Those weren't hauntings or his imagination. That was Iris, confused and wandering at night, moving things, trying to complete tasks her fragmented mind insisted were important. Benedict's guilt about Constance made devastating sense now. He couldn't pursue a relationship because he was still married. Iris was alive, even if her mind was dying. To love someone else, to move on, would have been betrayal of the deepest kind. Calder read through tears, his heart breaking for both of them. Iris's final coherent entry was dated late autumn, about 3 years after Benedict's first journal began. I don't know who I am anymore, but I know I am loved. Benedict reads to me even when I don't understand the words, holds my hand even when I pull away in confusion. Yesterday, or was it last week, he played our wedding song on an old record player. I couldn't remember getting married, but I cried anyway. The body remembers what the mind forgets. I'm so tired. I'm ready to rest. But I'm grateful, so grateful, that I got to be loved like this at the end. No entries followed. Just blank pages. Calder closed the journal, pressing it to his chest. He understood now why Benedict had hidden this separately, why he'd never mentioned Iris's survival in his own journal. This was too private, too sacred. If authorities had known Iris was alive, they might have intervened, forced her into institutional care, destroyed the dignity Benedict was trying to preserve. The memorial service for Iris, that must have been real, held after she actually died here at the cabin. Benedict would have buried her somewhere on the property, or perhaps scattered her ashes in the forest she never knew but that he'd built for her. Then Benedict had stayed alone, carrying the weight of that secret, carrying his grief for Iris, and his guilt about Constance, and his growing awareness that the same disease taking his wife was now taking him too. The tragedy was complete. Devastating and somehow beautiful. Calder climbed back upstairs, the journal clutched in his hand. Sawyer whined, pressing against his legs, sensing distress. He sat on the porch steps, staring at the forest without seeing it. Everything he'd believed about Benedict's story needed rewriting. The man hadn't been hiding from grief. He'd been protecting his wife's dignity, honoring her wish to fade privately, giving her the last gift he could offer, his complete, unwavering presence. For 2 years, Benedict had been everything: nurse, companion, caretaker, witness. He'd bathed her when she couldn't bathe herself, fed her when she forgot to eat, held her through nightmares she couldn't articulate. He'd maintained the fiction of her death so she could die on her own terms. That was love. Not the easy kind, celebrated in wedding vows, but the hard kind that shows up every day, when there's no reward, no recognition, no hope of recovery. The kind that stays. Calder thought about his own marriage. He'd left, not physically but emotionally, long before Vivian asked for the divorce. When things got difficult, when the recession hit and stress mounted, he'd withdrawn into himself, protected himself, saved himself at the cost of them. Benedict had done the opposite. He'd given everything, stayed completely, loved without reservation even when Iris couldn't remember his name. The difference between them was stark and humbling. But something else occurred to Calder. Should he tell Constance the truth? She deserved to know that Benedict hadn't simply been too broken to love her. He'd been married, actively caring for a dying wife. The rejection hadn't been about Constance at all. It had been about honoring vows that still mattered. Yet telling her would mean revealing Benedict's secret, the one he'd protected so carefully. It would mean admitting that the memorial service she'd probably attended for Iris had been staged, that Benedict had lied to everyone for years. The weight of knowing settled onto Calder's shoulders. Some truths didn't bring healing, they just brought more pain. Constance had found peace, believing Benedict loved her but couldn't reach past his grief. Knowing the full truth might ease her heart or might burden it further, with the knowledge that she'd been falling in love with a married man. However complicated the circumstances, he would have to decide. But not today. Today he would just sit with the enormity of what he'd discovered. Would honor Benedict and Iris both, the love they'd shared, the sacrifice Benedict had made, the grace with which Iris had faced her dissolution. The cabin looked different now, not just a refuge but a testament. Every board, every nail, every careful detail was an act of devotion. This wasn't just a house. It was a monument to love, at its most tested and most true. Calder stood, Iris's journal still in his hand. He walked to the garden Benedict had planted, the garden Iris had probably sat beside on good days, watching things grow that she'd never see harvested. He knelt in the dirt and made a promise. "I'll finish what you started," he said quietly. "I'll make this place what you intended. And I'll learn from you, both of you. I'll learn what it means to stay, what it means to love when it's hard, what it means to be present for the people who matter." The forest answered with wind through the pines, steady and eternal. Calder had come here broken, looking for isolation. Instead, he'd found the story of two people who'd faced the worst kind of loss with the best kind of love. It changed everything. He would have to change too. Calder spent 3 days wrestling with what to do. Iris's journal sat on the desk, a weight he carried even when he wasn't touching it. Every time he looked at it, the same question returned. Did Constance deserve to know the truth? He found his answer in Benedict's building plans. They'd been in one of the crates all along, but Calder hadn't really studied them until now. Detailed sketches of the cabin, every measurement precise, notes filling the margins. But it was the annotations that told the real story. Iris wants window here to catch morning. Light. Ramp for wheelchair access. Install by autumn. Bedroom on main floor, no stairs for her to navigate. Handrails by door. She's unsteady now. Every design choice had been for her comfort, her safety, her dignity. This cabin wasn't just a refuge, it was an act of architecture as love letter. Benedict had built Iris a place to die with grace. Calder traced the drawings with his finger, understanding, clicking into place. The cabin was unfinished. Several features Benedict had sketched were never built. A back porch for sitting in the evenings, a greenhouse for the garden, a stone pathway from door to garden so Iris could walk without fear of falling. Benedict had run out of time. Either Iris's decline accelerated, or his own illness began, or both. The cabin remained incomplete, a promise half-kept. Calder made his decision then. He would finish it, would complete Benedict's vision exactly as designed. Not as his own project, but as a continuation of Benedict's devotion. The cabin would become what it was always meant to be, a testament to staying, to loving through the hardest moments, to choosing presence over protection. He called Shepherd Crane that afternoon. "I need help," Calder said. "I want to finish some construction projects, and I don't have all the skills I need." Shepherd arrived the next morning with tools and enthusiasm. Calder showed him Benedict's plans, explained what he wanted to build. "This is good work," Shepherd said, studying the drawings. Benedict knew what he was doing. These additions would really complete the place. They worked together over the following weeks, older man teaching skills Calder had never learned. How to properly mix concrete for the pathway. How to frame a porch that would withstand Montana winters. How to build a greenhouse that would capture maximum light while protecting delicate plants. The work was meditative, purposeful. As they hammered and measured and cut, Shepherd shared stories about his own wife, who died 10 years earlier. "Cancer," Shepherd said one afternoon while they were setting posts for the porch. "Took 18 months from diagnosis to the end. Worst time of my life, and also the best in a strange way. You learn what matters when time becomes finite. Learn who you really are when everything else is stripped away. Did you ever think about remarrying?" Calder asked. "Thought about it. Even dated a bit, few years after. But I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I kept comparing everyone to her. That wasn't fair to them or me. Some people get second chances at love. Some of us just get the one great one, and that has to be enough. Do you regret not trying harder?" Shepherd considered, sighting along a board to check if it was level. "Sometimes, but regret's a useless emotion unless it teaches you something. I learned what I needed to learn from my marriage. Learned how to be present, how to love someone through their dying, how to keep living after. That's not nothing." Their conversations became a kind of therapy. Calder found himself talking about Vivian, about the ways he'd failed their marriage, about the guilt he carried. "You can't undo the past," Shepherd said, "but you can build a different future. That's what this is, isn't it?" He gestured at the cabin. "You're not just fixing wood and nails. You're fixing yourself." By October, the cabin was transformed. Roof fully repaired. Every window replaced with new glass that caught the autumn light. Interior walls refinished, the smoke damage erased, the space warm and livable. The back porch stood solid and welcoming, perfect for morning coffee or evening contemplation. The garden flourished with late-season vegetables. Calder had planted everything Benedict's journal mentioned. Tomatoes, lettuce, herbs, flowers. The greenhouse was framed and almost finished, ready to extend the growing season through winter, and the stone pathway curved gracefully from the front door to the garden. Each stone set level and secure, no danger of stumbling. Constance visited on a crisp afternoon in late October. She stood in the clearing, hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's exactly how Benedict would have wanted it." Calder showed her through the cabin, pointed out details only someone who'd read Benedict's plans would notice. The window placement, the wide doorways, the careful way everything was designed for ease and comfort. "He built this for someone he loved very much," Constance said, running her hand along the smooth wood of a windowsill. Calder held his tongue. Let her believe what she needed to believe. They planted flowers together in the garden, perennials that would return each spring. "A memorial for Benedict," Constance said. "For the man who'd shown her it was possible to feel again, even if it hurt." "I've made peace with it," she told Calder as they worked the soil. "With loving someone who couldn't love me back. It's better to have loved and lost than never to have felt that deeply at all." After she left, Calder stood in the completed cabin, Sawyer at his feet. 6 months since he'd arrived here broken and desperate. 6 months of reading Benedict's story, of learning hard lessons about love and loss, and the courage to stay. His phone rang. Maren, video call. "Dad, show me the cabin!" He walked her through it via his phone's camera, showing her each room, the porch, the garden, the greenhouse taking shape. She asked questions, laughed at Sawyer's antics, marveled at the transformation. "You did this?" she asked, wonder in her voice. "I had help, and I had good plans to follow. I'm proud of you, Dad. You look, I don't know, solid. Like you're standing on firm ground for the first time in years." "I am," he said. "I really am." That night he sat on the completed porch, wrapped in a jacket against the autumn chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, the forest alive with the sounds of creatures settling for winter. Tomorrow he would make a decision, would choose whether to tell Constance the truth about Iris, or let Benedict's secret remain buried with him. Either way, he was done hiding. Done running, done pushing away the people who mattered. The cabin stood complete around him, a monument to what love could be, at its most tested and most true. And Calder, for the first time in years, felt ready to build something of his own. December arrived with the first real snow. Fat flakes fell steadily, blanketing the cabin and forest in white silence. Calder stood at the window watching it accumulate, coffee in hand. Sawyer sprawled by the wood stove he'd finally got working properly. His phone rang. "Maren, Dad, I need you." Her voice was raw, broken in a way he'd never heard before. His chest tightened. "What happened?" "The wedding's off." He left. Just left. Said he couldn't do it, couldn't commit, that he'd made a mistake. She was crying now, words coming between sobs. "I thought he was the one. I thought we had forever. Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. Can I come there? To Montana? I can't be here right now. Everyone knows, everyone's asking questions, and I need to get away. I need my dad." The words hit him like a physical force. "Come home," he said without hesitation. "I'll pick you up at the airport. Just tell me when." "Really? You don't mind?" "Mind? Maren, I want you here. This is your home too now. Come, stay as long as you need." 3 days later, he met her at the small regional airport. She looked devastated. Eyes red and swollen, face pale, moving like someone recovering from illness. He wrapped her in his arms, and she collapsed against him, crying into his shoulder. "I've got you," he said. "We'll get through this." The drive to the cabin was quiet, except for occasional sniffles. She stared out the window at the snow-covered landscape, lost in her own pain. When they arrived, she stopped in the clearing, looking at the cabin with wonder, despite her grief. "Dad, it's beautiful. Come inside. It's warm." He'd prepared the loft for her, cleaned it thoroughly, set up a comfortable bed, added small touches to make it welcoming. She climbed up, looked around, and burst into tears again. "You did this for me." "Of course I did." The first few days she mostly slept. Calder let her be, understanding that grief needed its own time and space. He brought her meals, sat with her when she wanted company, gave her solitude when she needed it. Sawyer, with the instinct dogs have for wounded hearts, adopted her completely. The mutt barely left her side, curling up on her bed, following her on slow walks around the property, pressing against her legs when tears came. By the end of the first week, she started asking questions. About the cabin, about Benedict's story, about why Calder seemed so different from the distant, distracted father she'd known for the past 2 years. He told her everything. About finding the journals, about Benedict and Iris's love story, about the choice to stay, even when staying was the hardest thing imaginable. She listened intently, tears falling for different reasons now. He stayed, she said when Calder finished, even when it was hopeless, even when she didn't remember him. He stayed, yes. Why couldn't, her voice broke, why couldn't my fiancé stay? We weren't even married yet and he left. Calder chose his words carefully. Some people can't. It's not about you, about whether you're worthy or lovable enough. Some people just can't do the hard parts. They run when things get real. Like you and Mom. The question was sharp but fair. Yes, like your mom and me. We both ran in our own ways. Stopped fighting for it, stopped staying when it got difficult. I'm not proud of that. At least you're honest now. They talked for hours that night, about relationships, about commitment, about the difference between failing and giving up. Calder shared what he'd learned from Benedict, about how staying wasn't about never doubting, but about choosing to stay despite the doubt. Will I be okay? Maren asked, her voice small and young. Yes, Calder said with absolute certainty. You'll be okay. It'll take time, but you'll heal. I know because I'm watching it happen to me, she believed him. Not because he was her father, but because she could see the evidence in the cabin he'd restored, in the way he showed up for her now, in the groundedness that had replaced his earlier drift. The second week, she started helping with small projects around the cabin, painting trim, organizing the kitchen, hanging curtains. The work gave her hands something to do while her heart processed the loss. They decorated for Christmas together, a small tree, simple ornaments, evergreen branches on the mantel. Calder invited Constance for dinner, and the three of them shared a meal that was quiet but genuine. You raised a wonderful daughter, Constance told Calder as they cleaned dishes. She raised herself, mostly. I'm just grateful she's giving me another chance. On Christmas Eve, Maren came downstairs with papers in her hand, Calder's manuscript about Benedict and Iris. She'd found it on the shelf. Read it in one sitting. Dad, this is beautiful. You have to share this story. It's private. Benedict's story, not mine to tell, but people need it. I needed it. Knowing that someone loved that hard, that completely, it helps. It doesn't fix my broken heart, but it helps me believe in love again anyway. Her words planted a seed he couldn't ignore. Maren stayed through New Year's, 3 weeks total. By the time she prepared to return to Scotland, colour had returned to her cheeks, light to her eyes. She wasn't healed. Grief didn't work that quickly, but she was healing. The difference was visible. You'll be okay without me, she asked the night before her departure. I'll be okay, Calder promised. And so will you. I know, she hugged him tight. Thank you for being here. For really being here. Not just going through the motions. After she left, the cabin felt simultaneously empty and full. Empty of her physical presence, but full of the connection they'd rebuilt. Calder had his daughter back, really back, and the knowledge settled into his bones like warmth, but Maren's words about the manuscript haunted him. You need to finish your own story, she'd said. You've told Benedict's story. Now tell yours. He knew what she meant. There was one piece of unfinished business, one person he'd never properly released, Vivian. That night, Calder sat at Benedict's desk, his desk now, and began to write. Not about Benedict and Iris, but about himself and Vivian. About their marriage, its slow death, his role in that death. No blame, no bitterness, just honesty. He wrote for hours, and the words came easier than he expected. He acknowledged his withdrawal, the walls he'd built, the distance he'd created long before she'd asked for divorce. He thanked her for the good years, and there had been good years, before everything fell apart. He apologized for the bad ones, for his absence even when physically present, for expecting her to shoulder his stress and disappointment. Most importantly, he forgave her, and asked her forgiveness in return. I hope you found happiness, he wrote near the end. I'm learning to find mine. I'm learning what it means to stay, not in a marriage that ended, but in my own life with the people who matter. Thank you for showing me, through our failure, what I needed to change. I hope Montana is teaching me what you couldn't. He signed it, sealed it, mailed it the next morning before he could second-guess himself. The response arrived a week later. Vivian's handwriting on the envelope made his heart skip, but when he opened it, he found only grace. "Calder," she wrote, "thank you for your honesty. I've been carrying guilt too, for giving up, for falling out of love, for not fighting harder when things got difficult. We both failed and we both survived. I'm with someone now. His name is Gregory. He's kind, patient, and present in ways I needed. I hope you can be happy for me, because I'm genuinely happy for you. The man who wrote that letter is not the man I divorced. You've grown. Keep growing. Keep staying. You deserve the peace you're finding." Calder read it 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the wooden box with his wedding ring. Artifacts of a previous life, honored but no longer defining, the weight he'd carried for 2 years lifted, not all at once, but like snow melting in spring, gradually, inevitably leaving fertile ground behind. He walked to the garden, to the spot where he'd promised Benedict he'd learn to stay. The wedding ring had been in his pocket since reading Vivian's letter. He held it one last time, feeling its weight, its history, everything it had meant. Then he dug a small hole near the flowers Constance had planted, and buried it, not with anger or sadness, but with gratitude. For what was, for what could have been, for the lessons learned through failure. "Thank you," he said to the earth, to the past, to Vivian. "Thank you for 22 years. Thank you for letting me go. Thank you for moving forward." The ritual felt right. Final that afternoon, Shepard stopped by with news. A woman named Judith runs the bookstore in town. Recently widowed, maybe 5 years back. Mentioned you might like to meet her. Just for coffee, no pressure. 6 months ago, Calder would have declined immediately. 3 months ago, he might have made excuses. Now he surprised himself. "Tell her I'll stop by this week," Shepard grinned. "Good man. She's sharp, reads everything, knows her way around grief. I think you two might understand each other." After Shepard left, Calder returned to the manuscript. Read through what he'd written about Benedict and Iris, about the cabin, about the journey from brokenness to something resembling wholeness. Marin was right. This story deserved to be shared, not for fame or recognition, but because stories of love and loss and choosing to stay might help someone else who was broken find their way forward. He submitted it to a small press Marin had recommended, with a dedication to Benedict and Iris Thorne, who taught me that love means staying, and to everyone who's learning to rebuild. Snow fell gently outside as he typed the final words. Sawyer dozed by the fire. The cabin stood warm and solid around him, every board, every nail, a testament to devotion, to completion, to promises kept across time. 7 months ago, Calder had come here to hide, to disappear into wilderness and stop being anyone at all. Instead, he'd discovered who he could be, someone who stayed, someone who showed up, someone who honored the past while building toward a future. The difference was everything. He closed his laptop, poured coffee, and stepped onto the porch Benedict had designed but never built. The view stretched endlessly, forest and mountain and sky so vast it made human problems feel both insignificant and profound. Somewhere out there, Marin was rebuilding her life. Vivian was building a new one with Gregory. Benedict and Iris rested together, their love story preserved in journals and timber and the very bones of this place. And Calder stood present in his own life, finally, completely, ready for whatever came next. Spring arrived in Montana with sudden, startling warmth. Snow melted, revealing ground eager for planting. The garden beds Calder had restored came alive with green shoots, perennials returning, bulbs pushing through soil, the promise of life renewing itself. 1 year. He'd been at the cabin for 1 full year. The transformation was complete. Every window caught light exactly as Benedict had designed. The back porch hosted morning coffee and evening contemplation. The greenhouse sheltered seedlings that would soon transplant to the garden. The stone pathway wound smooth and safe from door to earth. But the real transformation wasn't the cabin. It was the man who'd rebuilt it. Calder stood at the garden's edge, Sawyer beside him surveying their work. Tomatoes already climbing stakes, lettuce in neat rows, herbs fragrant in the warming air. Everything Benedict had planted, Calder had replanted. Everything Benedict had intended, Calder had completed. "We did it," he said to the dog, to the forest, to Benedict's memory. "We finished what you started." His phone chimed. A text from Maren, time-stamped early morning, her time in Scotland. "Good news. Met someone. Taking it slow, but Dad, he stays. When things get hard, he doesn't run. Thought you'd want to know I'm learning from the right examples now." Calder smiled, typed back, "That's the best news. Proud of you, sweetheart. Love you." The manuscript had been published 2 months ago by a small press that specialized in literary non-fiction. Staying, a love story sold modestly but meaningfully. Letters arrived weekly from readers, people who'd lost spouses, who'd struggled through grief, who needed to know that staying was possible even when everything felt impossible. Calder answered every letter personally, just as Benedict had answered students' questions decades ago. The act of bearing witness to others' pain while sharing what he'd learned felt right, felt like purpose. The community college had offered him a part-time position teaching architecture to adult learners. He'd accepted, found joy in sharing his knowledge with people starting over, people who understood that it's never too late to build something new. And then there was Judith. They'd been seeing each other for 3 months now. Slow, careful, both of them carrying histories that made them cautious. She ran the bookstore in town, had lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier. Their first coffee had stretched into 3 hours of conversation about books, about loss, about the strange gift of getting a second chance at life when you thought the story was over. She'd read his manuscript, wept over it, understood immediately what Benedict and Iris's story meant. "This is what love looks like," she'd said, holding the book. "Not the easy beginning, but the hard middle and the brave ending. Thank you for sharing it." They took things slowly. Dinners in town, walks with Sawyer, quiet evenings reading together. No rush, no pressure, just 2 people choosing to stay open to possibility. Constance remained a friend, visiting monthly. They'd plant flowers together, share meals, talk about Benedict with affection and acceptance. Calder had never told her about Iris's survival, about the true depth of Benedict's sacrifice. Some truths served no purpose but pain. Constance had peace. That was enough. The wedding invitation arrived in April. Maren was getting married in June. Different man, right timing. Calder would walk her down the aisle as planned. Vivian would be there too with Gregory. They'd exchanged friendly emails, could occupy the same space without pain. Progress neither of them had imagined possible a year ago. On a warm May evening, Shepard and Judith joined Calder for dinner on the completed porch. They ate simply, talked easily, laughed often. 3 people who'd known loss, who'd survived it, who'd chosen to keep building despite everything. "To staying," Shepard said, raising his glass. "To staying," they echoed, after they left. Calder walked the property one last time before dark. The forest whispered its eternal song. The garden grew in the gathering dusk. The cabin stood solid and complete, every promise kept. He paused at the spot where he'd buried his wedding ring. Flowers bloomed there now, bright and alive, fed by what had been laid to rest. Benedict's journals remained on the desk in the cabin, preserved and honored. Iris's journal stayed hidden, her secret protected. Their love story lived in the timber and stone, in every careful detail of this place they'd built together. Calder had arrived here broken, believing he was finished. Instead, he'd found a story that taught him what love really meant. Not the easy declarations, but the hard staying. Not the beginning's passion, but the middle's persistence and the end's grace. He'd learned that broken things could hold beauty, that second chances existed for those brave enough to take them, that staying in your own life with the people who matter through the hard parts was the most courageous choice of all. Inside, Sawyer waited by the door, tail wagging. The fire burned warm in the wood stove. Coffee sat ready for morning. Books lined the shelves, including his own with "Staying" written on the spine. waiting to help the next broken person find their way home. Calder closed the door on another day, another small victory against despair. The burned place restored, the broken man healed, and in the quiet of the Montana wilderness, life continued, beautiful, imperfect, and whole, ready for tomorrow, whatever it might bring, ready to stay.